The Kabbalah, by Adolphe Franck. Preface. A doctrine exhibiting manifold similarities to the philosophies of Plato and Spinoza. A doctrine whose expression frequently ascends to the majestic resonance of religious poetry. A doctrine originating in the same land and at virtually the same epoch as Christianity. A doctrine that evolved and disseminated over a span exceeding 12 centuries under the veil of the profoundest mystery, lacking any corroborating evidence save the testimony of an ostensible ancient tradition, and possessing no discernible motive beyond the yearning to penetrate more intimately the significance of the sacred books. Such is the doctrine discovered within the original writings and the most archaic fragments of the Kabbalah, once sifted and purged of all their dross. It occurred to me that, during an era in which all historical inquiries, and the history of philosophy in particular, have assumed paramount importance, and at a time when the prevailing conviction dictates that the human intellect can manifest itself comprehensively only through the totality of its creations, such a subject, considered from a vantage point elevated far above any sectarian partisanship, might justly lay claim to scholarly attention. Furthermore, the very difficulties encompassing such a subject, alongside the obscurity inherent in both its concepts and its language, may secure a measure of indulgence for one who dares to address it. Yet, this is not the sole reason the Kabbalah commends itself to the consideration of earnest intellects. It must be recalled that from the dawn of the 16th century until the mid-17th century, it exerted a considerable influence upon theology, philosophy, the natural sciences, and medicine. It was the spirit of the Kabbalah that inspired figures such as Pico della Mirandola, Cornelius Agrippa, Reuchlin, Paracelsus, Henry Moore, Robert Flood, Van Helmont, and even Jacob Boehme, the greatest among all those who wandered astray in the pursuit of a universal science, a singular discipline that would undertake to illuminate the very essence of the interconnectedness of all things within the profoundest depths of the divine nature. Less audacious than a modern critic who shall presently be mentioned, I dare not, at this juncture, invoke the name of Spinoza. I make no pretense of having discovered an entirely uncharted territory. On the contrary, I must concede that years would be required merely to review all that has been authored concerning the Kabbalah, even if one were to commence only from the moment the printing press first laid bare its secrets. Yet, what contradictory opinions, what impassioned judgments, what fantastical hypotheses, and, viewed comprehensively, what intractable chaos exists within that mass of Hebrew, Latin, and German volumes, published in every conceivable format and scored with citations in a multitude of languages. Furthermore, it must be noted that this discord manifests not solely in the evaluation of the doctrines to be disseminated, or in the exceedingly complex problem of their origins, but presents itself in an equally conspicuous manner within the very exposition of the doctrines themselves. For this reason, the contemporary method of studying the subject ought not to be deemed futile, provided it grounds its inquiries upon original documents, the most accredited traditions, and the most authentic texts, while simultaneously embracing all that is valid and true in antecedent research. Before embarking upon this program of research, however, I deem it necessary to present the reader with a concise review of the works that engendered this original concept and which, in some measure, harbor the foundational elements of this endeavor. It will thus become possible to form a more accurate assessment of the extent to which scholarship has succeeded in illuminating this mysterious subject, as well as the precise nature of the task bequeathed to us by our predecessors. The fulfillment of that objective constitutes the aim of this preface. I shall not discourse upon the considerable number of modern Kabbalists who wrote in Hebrew. Individually, their distinguishing characteristics are of such marginal significance, and, Save for a few notable exceptions, they penetrate so superficially into the depths of the system that it would prove exceedingly difficult and equally tedious to enumerate each one separately. Let it suffice to state that they are divided into two schools, both established in Palestine at approximately the same time, namely the mid-16th century. One was founded by Moses Cordero, the other by Isaac Luria, whom a fraction of the Jewish populace regarded as the harbinger of the Messiah. Notwithstanding the superstitious veneration these two figures instilled in their disciples, both were merely commentators devoid of genuine originality. Cordero, at the very least, adhered closely to the literal meaning of the original writings, albeit without deeply penetrating their spirit. Conversely, Luria nearly always deviated from the authentic text to give unfettered rein to his reveries, which were, in reality, the delusions of a diseased mind. The dreams of the afflicted are ultimately vain. I need not specify which of the two I have consulted more frequently, but I cannot refrain from observing that prevailing opinion accords greater consequence to the latter. I shall set aside those writers who have made but fleeting reference to the Kabbalah, figures such as Richard Simon, Burnett, and Huttingen, as well as those who, confining their inquiries to biography, bibliography, and history proper, do little more than indicate the appropriate sources for investigation, such as Wolff, Basnage, and Bartolacci. In a word, I dismiss those authors who are content merely to summarize, and occasionally to repeat, the assertions of others. Pertaining to our subject, the authors of the introduction to the philosophy of the Hebrews belong to this latter category, as do the modern historians of philosophy who, to varying degrees, copied Brucker, just as Brucker himself laid under contribution the dissertations of the Spanish rabbi Abraham Cohen Herrera, which are decidedly more Neoplatonic and Arabic than Kabbalistic in character. Following all these eliminations, I must still bring to prominence a number of authors who have undertaken a more rigorous study of the esoteric doctrine of the Hebrews, or to whom we must, at minimum, accord the credit for extracting that doctrine from the profound obscurity in which it had languished until the close of the 15th century. The first individual to reveal the name and existence of the Kabbalah to Christian Europe was a man who, despite the aberrations of his fervent imagination, despite the impulsive ardor of his enthusiastic intellect, and perhaps even by virtue of the potency of these brilliant flaws, imparted a vigorous impulsion to the intellectual currents of his century. We refer to Raymond Lullis. It would be exceedingly difficult to ascertain the precise extent to which Raymond Lullis was initiated into this mysterious science, or the exact influence it exerted over his own doctrines. Under no circumstances will I affirm, in agreement with a certain historian of philosophy, that Raymond Lullis derived the identity of God and nature from this science. It remains unequivocally certain, however, that he maintained a lofty conception of the Kabbalah. He regarded it as a divine science and a genuine revelation, whose light shone forth for the illumination of the rational soul. Furthermore, it is permissible to surmise that the artificial methodologies employed by the Kabbalists to bind their tenets to the words of Holy Writ, alongside their frequent substitution of numbers and letters for concepts and words, contributed significantly to the invention of the great art. It is noteworthy that Raymond Lullis had already drawn a distinction between ancient and modern Kabbalists more than 2.5 centuries prior to the emergence of the rival schools of Luria and Cordavra, the very epoch to which certain modern critics have sought to ascribe the genesis of the entire Kabbalistic discipline. The precedent established by the Majorcan philosopher remained unimitated for an extended period. Following his era, the study of the Kabbalah lapsed into oblivion until Pico della Mirandola and Reuchlin emerged to cast light anew upon a science that, save for a restricted circle of adepts, had previously been known to the broader world merely by name and rumor of its existence. These two men, equally venerated by their century for their intellectual audacity and their extensive erudition, were nevertheless quite far from penetrating the profound depths and complexities of the subject. Pico della Mirandola endeavored to condense, into a mere handful of propositions, whose origins he neglects to cite and among which a coherent connection is scarcely discernible, a system as expansive, multifaceted, and robustly constructed as the one under our present investigation. Admittedly, these propositions were originally intended for public disputation and argumentative elaboration. However, in the state in which they have reached us, they remain unintelligible, not only due to their brevity but also because of their isolation, and it is certainly not within a few tenuous digressions, scattered haphazardly throughout works of the most disparate character, that one might hope to discover the unity, thematic progression, or evidentiary truth that we are entitled to demand from a work of such profound importance. The other scholar, less swept away by his imagination, proved more systematic and lucid, yet he was less erudite and, regrettably, lacked the aptitude to draw from the richest and most reliable sources available to him. Like the Italian author, who, despite being born later, preceded him upon this intellectual path, Reuchlin failed to cite his authorities, but it is easy to discern in his work the limited critical spirit of Joseph of Castile, rather than that of the spurious Abraham ben Dior, a 14th-century commentator who amalgamated Aristotelian concepts, along with whatever he understood of the Greek traditions as interpreted by the Arabians, into his Kabbalistic knowledge. Furthermore, the dramatic structure adopted by Reuchlin is neither precise nor sufficiently serious for a subject of this magnitude, and it is not without vexation that one observes him merely grazing the most paramount questions to establish, through a few indefinite analogies, an imaginary affiliation between the Kabbalah and the doctrines of Pythagoras. Reuchlin maintained that the founder of the Italian school was a disciple of the Kabbalists, to whom he owed not only the foundational principles and the symbolic framework of his system but also the traditional character of his teachings. From this arise those subtleties and distortions that equally disfigure the two distinct orders of ideas one endeavors to conflate. Of the two works that cemented Reuchlin's renown, only one, De Arte Kabbalistica, contains a structured exposition of the esoteric doctrines of the Hebrews. The other, which was indeed published first, serves merely as an introduction to the former volume. This introduction, however, is conceived from a highly personal perspective, even as it presents itself as the straightforward elaboration of a more ancient concept. It is within this treatise that the author, under the pretext of defining the names consecrated to God, gives free rein to his mystical and venturesome spirit. It is here that he endeavors to demonstrate broadly that all religious philosophy, whether of Grecian or Oriental origin, ultimately stems from the Hebrew scriptures, and it is here that he lays the foundation for what would later be termed the Christian Kabbalah. Dating from that epoch, Kabbalistic ideas became the object of broader interest, commanding serious and substantial regard not only within works of high erudition but also across the scientific and religious movements of the 16th and 17th centuries. It was during this period that the two major works of Cornelius Agrippa successively appeared, alongside the erudite and curious imaginings of Postel, the repertory of Christian Kabbalists published by Pistorius, the translations of Joseph Voisin, Kirchner's comprehensive researches into Oriental antiquity, and, ultimately, the synthesis and culmination of all these endeavors the Kabbalah unveiled. In Cornelius Agrippa we encounter a dual persona. On the one hand, the author of De Occulta Philosophia, an enthusiastic defender of mystical reveries and an impassioned adept of the fantastical arts, and on the other, the disheartened skeptic who laments the uncertainty and vanity of the sciences. Contrary to what one might presume, it was certainly not the former persona that rendered the greatest service to the study of the Kabbalah. On the contrary, by losing sight of the system's metaphysical dimension, of its very essence and authentic source, and by strictly adhering to its mystical form while driving the latter to its ultimate consequences of astrology and magic, he contributed considerably to alienating solemn and serious minds from the Kabbalah. However, Agrippa the skeptic, Agrippa recovered from his mystic intoxications and, so to speak, restored to the exercise of reason, recognized the rare antiquity of Kabbalistic concepts and their relationship to the various sects of Gnosticism, and it was also he who highlighted the resemblance between the diverse attributes recognized by the Kabbalists, otherwise known as the 10 Sephiroth, and the 10 mystical names discussed by Saint Jerome in his epistle to Marcella. To the best of my knowledge, Postel was the first to translate into Latin the most ancient and obscure monument of the Kabbalah. The Book of Formation, a work ascribed at times by fabulous tradition to the patriarch Abraham, and at times even to Adam himself. Insofar as one can judge from this translation, which remains as opaque as its source text, it generally appears to us to be faithful. However, little of use can be gleaned from the commentaries that follow the text, wherein the author, posturing as the apostle of a novel religion, deploys his wealth of erudition merely to justify the deviations of an unruly imagination. Postel is additionally credited with an unpublished translation of the Zohar, which we have sought in vain within the manuscripts of the Royal Library. Pistorius set for himself a more pragmatic and modest objective. He endeavored to consolidate into a single collection all the writings published on the Kabbalah or imbued with its spirit, but for reasons unknown, he abandoned his undertaking when it was only half completed. Of the 2 massive volumes originally intended to comprise the work, one was dedicated to all Kabbalistic literature written in Hebrew and, consequently, under the influence of Judaism. The other was devoted to the Christian Kabbalists, or, to use the author's own words, to those who, professing Christianity, are invariably distinguished by a pious and honest life, and whose writings, therefore, no one would dismiss as Jewish ramblings. This constituted a prudent precaution against the deep-seated prejudices of his era. Yet only the latter volume ever appeared. This volume contains, in addition to the Latin translation of the Sefer Yetzirah and the 2 previously mentioned works of Reuchlin, a mystical and entirely arbitrary commentary on Pico della Mirandolas' theses, a Latin translation of the work by Joseph of Castile that served as the foundation for De Verbo Mirifico, and, finally, various treatises by 2 Jewish authors. One of these was led to embrace Christianity through his study of the Kabbalah, this being Paul Ricci, physician to Emperor Maximilian I, while the other was the son of the renowned Abravanel, Judah Abravanel, better known as Leon the Hebrew. The latter undoubtedly warrants a distinguished place within the broader history of mysticism on account of his dialogues on love, of which several French translations exist. However, as his work pertains to the Kabbalah only indirectly, it will suffice to casually highlight, from one of the most crucial vantage points, the ideas from which similar conclusions were drawn. Ricci, who devoted greater attention to the allegorical form rather than the mystical foundation of these traditions, contented himself with following Reuchlin's lead from a distance, and like his predecessor, he attempted to demonstrate all the essential tenets of Christianity by means of Kabbalistic methodology. Such is the defining character of his work, of the Heavenly Agriculture. He is additionally the author of an introduction to the Kabbalah in which he restricts himself to summarizing, somewhat cursorily, the perspectives articulated by his predecessors. But unlike them, he does not date back the tradition which he expounds to the patriarchs, or to the progenitor of the human race. He remains content in the conviction that these traditions were already prevalent at the time when Christ commenced the preaching of his doctrine, and that they have paved the way for the new covenant. For, according to his assertion, those thousands of Jews who embraced the gospel without forsaking the faith of their forebears were none other but the Kabbalists of that era. I shall yet mention here Joseph Voisin, whose principal merit regarding the Kabbalah is that he faithfully translated from the Zohar several texts on the nature of the soul, and then hastened to works more important, at least because of the influence they exerted. The name of Kirchner cannot be spoken without profound reverence. He was a veritable living encyclopedia of all the sciences. No discipline was entirely beyond his prodigious erudition, and there are several, notably archaeology, philology, and natural sciences, that are indebted to him for significant discoveries. But it is also acknowledged that this remarkable scholar did not shine through those faculties which go to make up the critic and the philosopher, and that at times he exhibits even uncommon credulity. Such is the disposition he evinces all through his exposition of the doctrines of the Kabbalists. Thus, he harbors not a moment's doubt that the Kabbalah was first brought to Egypt by the patriarch Abraham, and that from Egypt it spread gradually through the remainder of the Orient, mingling with all the religions and all the systems of philosophy. But, while conceding this imaginary authority and this fabulous antiquity, he despoils the work of its genuine merits. The profound and original concepts, the audacious creeds the Kabbalah contains, and the striking insights it darts into the foundations of every religion and morality, escape entirely his feeble perception, which is struck only by the symbolical forms, the use and abuse of which seem to exist in the very nature of mysticism. The Kabbalah exists for him only in this gross envelope with its thousands of combinations of numbers and letters, its arbitrary ciphers, and finally, its more or less fantastical procedures by means of which it compels the sacred script to lend such meaning as to find access to minds rebellious to all authority save the Bible. The facts and the texts which I have assembled in this volume aim to dismantle this peculiar point of view and, therefore, I shall not dwell upon it any longer. I will merely state that Kirchner, just like Reuchlin and Pico de la Mirandola, was acquainted solely with the works of the modern Kabbalists, the majority of whom halted midway on the path to wisdom at the dead letter and senseless symbols. On the subject presently occupying us, there is today no work more comprehensive, more exact and more worthy of respect due to much labor and sacrifice, than that of the Baron of Rosenroth or the Kabbalah Unveiled. There are precious texts within that volume which are accompanied by generally faithful translations, among them the most ancient fragments of the Zohar, the preeminent work of the Kabbalah, and where there are no texts it provides extensive analyses and highly detailed tables. It contains also either numerous extracts or complete treatises from modern Kabbalists, a kind of dictionary which prepares us more for the knowledge of concepts than of words. And finally, under the pretext, and perhaps in the sincere hope of converting the adepts of the Kabbalah to Christianity, the author compiled all the passages of the New Testament which show any resemblance to their doctrine. Yet, there must be no illusion as to the character of this monumental work. Like its predecessors, it does not throw any more light on the origin, the transmission, or the authenticity of the most ancient monuments of the Kabbalah. In vain, too, will one search there for a systematically ordered and comprehensive exposition of the Kabbalistic framework. It contains only such material which, perforce, must enter into a work of this nature, and even when considered from this singular point of view, it is not immune to the lash of criticism. Although excessively severe in certain of his expressions, Buddy was not unjust when he said, It is an obscure and convoluted work in which the necessary and the unnecessary, the useful and the superfluous, are cast together pell-mell, in the same chaos. With a more judicious selection, his work might have proven richer and less unwieldy. In fact, why did he not relegate the reveries of Henry Morris, which share nothing in common with the mystic theology of the Hebrews, to their proper place, that is, in the collected works of this author? And I would level the same critique at the ostensibly Kabbalistic work of Herrera. This Spanish rabbi, notable for his philosophical erudition, was not content to substitute the modern traditions of the school of Isaac Luria for the genuine principles of the Kabbalah, but he also discovered the secret of disfiguring these tenets by mingling with them the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, Avicenna, and Pico de la Mirandola, in short, all that he had absorbed of Greek and Arabian philosophy. Modern historians of philosophy have predominantly adopted Herrera for their guide in the interpretations of the Kabbalah, probably because of the didactic structure of his dissertations and the precision of his language. And as such a guide has been embraced, no wonder that quite recent origin has been ascribed to this science, or that it was looked upon as a faint imitation, a poorly disguised plagiarism of the other well-known systems. Finally, since the author of the Kabbalah Denudata was unwilling to adhere to the most ancient sources and to acquaint us through more abundant quotations with the originality and fascinating insights concealed in the Zohar, why this predilection for the commentaries of Isaac Luria, which no individual in possession of his reason can abide reading? Would not the sacrifices and the laborious vigils which, by the author's own admission, it cost him to unearth those sterile chimeras, have been far better expended upon the long chain of Kabbalists still too little known, commencing at Saadia around the 10th century and concluding with the 13th century at Nachmanides? In this manner, by encompassing all the traditions composing the Zohar, we would have had before our very eyes the uninterrupted chain of Kabbalistic heritage, stretching from the moment when they were first written down until the juncture when their secrecy was completely breached by Moses de Leon. Had this endeavor proved excessively arduous, it would, at least, have been feasible to have devoted some space to the esteemed works of Nachmanides, the staunch defender of the celebrated Moses ben Maimon, and whose Kabbalistic mastery inspired admiration so intense that it was reputedly conveyed to him by the prophet Elijah from heaven. Despite its lacunae and its numerous imperfections, Rosenrotha's conscientious labor will stand perpetually as a monument of patience and erudition, and it will be consulted by all who will desire to understand the intellectual products among the Jews, or by those who wish to observe mysticism in all its forms and in all its resultant manifestations. It is owing to his profound comprehension of the Kabbalah that this doctrine has ceased to be studied exclusively either as an instrument of proselytization or as an occult science. It has assumed a rightful place in philosophical and philological research, in the broader history of philosophy, and in rational theology, which has sought by its light to elucidate some of the challenging passages of the New Testament. The first whom we observe venturing in this direction is George Wachter, theologian and distinguished philosopher, who, because of the independence of his intellect, was falsely accused of Spinozism, and who was the author of an earnest attempt to reconcile the two disciplines to which he had consecrated equal devotion. Wachter's attention was initially drawn to the Kabbalah in the following manner. A Protestant of the Augsburg Confession, captivated by this system to which he had previously been a stranger, publicly converted to Judaism, discarded his given name, and assumed the appellation of Moses Germanus. He foolishly challenged Wachter to emulate his example and engaged him in a correspondence from which emerged a modest volume entitled Spinozaism in Judaism. The treatise sheds little light upon the nature or the origin of Kabbalistic ideas, but it raises a question of profound interest. Was Spinoza initiated into the Kabbalah, and what degree of influence did this doctrine exert upon his philosophical system? Until that juncture, it was the prevailing consensus among scholars that a rather close affinity existed between the paramount tenets of the Kabbalist science and the fundamental dogmas of the Christian religion. Wachter undertook to demonstrate that these two paradigms of thought are separated by an abyss, for, in his estimation, the Kabbalah amounted to nothing less than atheism, the negation of God and the deification of the world, a doctrine he attributed to the Dutch philosopher and to which Spinoza purportedly imparted a more modern form. We need not investigate here whether the two systems, per se, are judiciously or injudiciously assessed, but rather whether there exists any foundation for the theory of their affinity or for their historical succession. The sole evidence provided consists of two notably significant passages, indeed one drawn from Ethics, the other from Spinoza's correspondence. The latter reads, "When I affirm that all things exist within God, and that in him all things move, I speak as St. Paul did, and as all the philosophers of antiquity have done, albeit expressing myself in a different manner, and I even dare to add, like all the ancient Hebrews, insofar as one may judge from certain of their traditions that have been altered in myriad ways." Evidently, only the Kabbalistic traditions are referenced in these lines, given that those which the Jews collected in the Talmud consist solely of recitals or ceremonial laws. The passage from Ethics is even more decisive. Having discoursed upon the unity of substance, Spinoza adds, "It is this principle that some of the Hebrews seem to have perceived as though through a cloud, when they conceived of God, the intelligence of God, and the object subject to the action of that intelligence as constituting one and the same entity." The historical import of these words cannot be mistaken when juxtaposed with the ensuing lines, translated almost literally from a Kabbalistic work functioning as the most faithful commentary upon the Zohar. The knowledge of the Creator is unlike the knowledge of the creatures, for in the latter, the knowledge remains distinct from the known subject. This is designated by the following terms: the thought, he who thinks, and that which is thought of. The Creator, conversely, is himself the knowledge, the one who knows and the one known. God's manner of knowing does not truly consist in directing his thought toward things external to himself. It is by cognizing and knowing himself that he simultaneously cognizes and comprehends all that exists. Nothing exists that is not united with him, nor is there anything he could not find within his own substance. He is the prototype of all being, and within him all things exist in their purest and most consummate form, so that the perfection of creatures resides in this very existence, by virtue of which they find themselves united with the source of their being, and in proportion to their deviation from it, they descend from that sublime and perfect state. What conclusion may be drawn from these words? Is it that the ideas and the Cartesian method, that the entirely independent development of reason, and, above all, that individual judgments as well as the errors of genius count for nothing within the most audacious conception of which the history of modern philosophy can provide an example? This would constitute a peculiar paradox, one that we shall not even attempt to refute. Moreover, it is readily apparent from the very citations provided as authority that Spinoza possessed merely a rudimentary and uncertain understanding of the Kabbalah, the significance of which he could have recognized only following the genesis of his own system. But, strangely, having stripped Spinoza of all originality for the benefit of the Kabbalah, Wachter subsequently reduced that doctrine itself to a miserable plagiarism, a characterless compilation to which all the centuries during which it remained obscured, all the nations wherein the Jews were dispersed, and, consequently, the most contradictory systems had contributed. How could such a work be considered more atheistic than theistic? Would it not impart pantheism rather than the concept of a single God distinct from the world? Above all, how had it assumed in the ethics the form of rigorous unity, the inflexible vigor characteristic of the exact sciences? But we must do Wachter the justice of acknowledging that he modified his opinions considerably in a subsequent volume on the same subject. Thus, according to his revised perspective, Spinoza was no longer the apostle of atheism, but rather a true savant who, enlightened by a sublime science, recognized the divinity of Christ and all the verities of the Christian religion. He naively confesses that he had previously judged the philosopher without truly knowing him, and that he was prejudiced against him by preconceived notions and inflamed passions when recording his initial impressions. He equally offers an honorable apology to the Kabbalah by distinguishing two fundamentally distinct doctrines bearing that name. The modern Kabbalah languishes under the weight of his scorn and anathema, but the ancient Kabbalah, which, according to him, had endured until the Council of Nicaea, was a traditional science of the highest order, its origins lost in mysterious antiquity. The first Christians, the most ancient church fathers, possessed no other philosophy, and it is precisely this philosophy that led Spinoza onto the path of truth. The author stubbornly insists upon this point, rendering it the focal center of his researches. Though entirely superficial overall and occasionally far from accurate, this parallel drawn between the doctrine of Spinoza and that of the Kabbalists contributed significantly to the enlightenment of minds regarding the true significance of the Kabbalah. I refer here to its character and its metaphysical principles. That parallel prompted an examination proving that the theory which had provoked such profound surprise and scandal, the theory that God is a unique substance, as well as the immanent cause and true nature of all that exists, was by no means novel, that it had already emerged previously, at the very cradle of Christianity, under the very name of the religion. But this concept is also encountered elsewhere in an antiquity no less remote. Where, then, must one look for the origin of this idea? Was it Greece, or the Egypt of the Ptolemies that imparted it to Palestine? Is it Palestine that first discovered it? Or is it necessary to delve still further back into the Orient? Such are the inquiries that primarily occupied scholarly minds, and such is the significance attached to the Kabbalistic traditions since that era by all save a few critics who remain peculiarly attentive to nothing but form. It is no longer a matter of a specific method of interpretation applied to Holy Writ, nor of mysteries extending far beyond the bounds of reason, which God himself revealed whether to Moses, to Abraham, or to Adam, but it is a question of a purely human science, of a system encompassing within itself the entire metaphysics of an ancient people, and, therefore, of profound interest to the history of the human intellect, once more a philosophical viewpoint that superseded allegory and mysticism. This ethos is evident not only in Brucker's exposition, where it is entirely appropriate, but it also appears to be generally prevalent. Thus, in 1785, a learned association, the Society for the Investigation of Antiquities at Kassel, launched an academic competition centered upon the following topic. Does the doctrine of the Kabbalists, according to which all things are engendered through the emanation of the very essence of God, derive from Greek philosophy or not? Regrettably, the response proved far less sensible than the inquiry. The work which carried off the prize, being very little known and hardly deserving of recognition, certainly casts no new light upon the intrinsic nature of the Kabbalah or the origins of this system. Rather, it contents itself with reproducing the most degraded of fables. It purports to identify Kabbalistic ideas within the hymns of Orpheus and the philosophy of Thales and Pythagoras, rendering them contemporaries of the patriarchs, and, without the slightest hesitation, it presents them to us as the ancient wisdom of the Chaldeans. This is perhaps less surprising when one considers that the author belonged to the sect of the Illuminati, an order which, following the example of all such associations, dated its annals back to the very cradle of humanity. However, rational theology, as it is termed in Germany, that is, the absolutely independent method of expounding the Holy Scriptures, of which Spinoza provided an exemplar in his theological political treatise, made frequent use of the Kabbalah. As previously noted, it utilized this tradition to explicate diverse passages within the epistles of St. Paul that referred to the heresies of antiquity. Furthermore, it sought therein the elucidation of the opening verses of the Gospel of St. John, attempting to render it beneficial for the study of both Gnosticism and ecclesiastical history in general. Contemporaneously, Tiedemann and Tenman had granted the Kabbalah a certain deed of possession within the history of philosophy, a status initially consecrated to it by Brucker. Shortly thereafter emerged the school of Hegel, which could scarcely fail to employ a system wherein it discovered, albeit in a different guise, several of its own doctrines. A reaction against this illustrious school was inevitably swift to follow, and it was evidently under the influence of such sentiment that the feudal work Kabbalism and Pantheism was composed. The author of that diminutive volume endeavors to prove, entirely at the expense of the evidence, that there exists no resemblance between the two systems he undertakes to compare. Indeed, it frequently occurs that the passages he employs as the foundation for his arguments are diametrically opposed to the deductions he derives from them. Furthermore, in matters of erudition, he is vastly inferior to the majority of his predecessors, surpassing them neither in his criticism of the sources nor in his philosophical appreciation of the ideas, notwithstanding the pedantic attire and the luxury of citations with which he delights in surrounding himself. Finally, Herr, a scholar justly entitled to an eminent rank among the theologians and Orientalists of Germany, has also recently sought to contribute his knowledge and skilled criticism to this subject. Yet, as he concerns himself with but one particular point, the origin of the Kabbalah, and as any proper appreciation of his opinions would demand profound discussion, I have reserved my commentary upon him for the body of this work, deeming it a more opportune occasion. This principle applies equally to all modern writers whose names, although deserving of a place here, have yet to be mentioned. Such are, in substance, the efforts undertaken thus far to discover the meanings and origins of the Kabbalistic texts. I do not wish for the conclusion to be drawn that everything must be initiated anew simply because one is struck only by those volumes which remain incomplete. On the contrary, I remain convinced that the labors, and even the errors, of such distinguished minds cannot be ignored without consequence by those who earnestly desire to study this same subject. Indeed, even were it possible to approach the original monuments without any external aid, it would nevertheless remain essential to ascertain beforehand the various interpretations that have been assigned to them up to the present day, for each of these corresponds to a perspective that is well-founded in itself, yet becomes deficient when adhered to exclusively. Thus, to corroborate what has just been stated and to summarize the foregoing briefly, the Kabbalah has been embraced by some, who focus solely upon its allegorical form and mystical character, with mystic enthusiasm as an anticipated revelation of Christian dogmas. Others, struck by its strange figures, the peculiar formulas beneath which it delights in concealing its true intentions, and the relations it incessantly establishes between man and every part of the universe, adopted it as an occult art. Still others, finally, seized primarily upon its metaphysical principles, striving to discover therein an antecedent, whether honorable or dishonorable, to the philosophy of their era. It is easily understood that, through partial and incomplete studies governed by various prejudices, one may discover all of these elements within the Kabbalah without necessarily contradicting the facts. However, in order to form an exact understanding and to determine the true position it holds among intellectual works, it must be studied neither in the interest of a particular system nor in the service of a religious belief. On the contrary, one must endeavor, for the sake of truth alone, to furnish the general history of human thought with elements that remain all too little known. This is the objective I aspire to achieve in the ensuing work, for which I have spared neither time nor scholarly research. Adolphe Franck. Introduction. Although one discovers within the Kabbalah a comprehensive system concerning matters of a moral and spiritual order, it can ultimately be considered neither a philosophy nor a religion. That is to say, it rests, at least in appearance, neither upon reason nor upon divine inspiration or ecclesiastical authority. Like the majority of the systems of the Middle Ages, it is the fruit of the union of these two intellectual powers. Essentially distinct from religious belief, under whose power and, one might add, whose protection it was born, it insinuated itself unnoticed into the minds of men, thanks to its peculiar forms and processes. These forms and processes would undoubtedly diminish the interest of which it is worthy, and would not consistently inspire conviction regarding the importance we feel justified in attributing to it, if, prior to explicating its various elements and attempting to resolve the questions incidental to it, we did not indicate with some precision the place it occupies among intellectual achievements, the rank it ought to hold among religious beliefs and philosophical systems, and, finally, the requirements or laws that might explain the peculiar mechanisms of its development. It is this task we shall attempt to accomplish with all possible brevity. It is a fact, proven by the entire history of humanity, that moral truth, the knowledge we are capable of acquiring concerning our nature, our destiny, and the fundamental principle of the universe, was initially accepted not upon the strength of reason or conscience, but rather through the effect of a power that acted more vigorously upon the minds of the people, and which possesses the general attribute of presenting ideas to us in a nearly material form, sometimes as a word descending from heaven to human ears, and at other times in the guise of a person who manifests them through examples and actions. This power, universally recognized as religion or revelation, has its own revolutions and laws. Notwithstanding the underlying unity of its nature, it alters its aspect, much like philosophy, poetry, and the arts across different centuries and countries. Yet, regardless of the time and place in which this power may establish itself, it cannot instantly impart to man all that he requires to know, not even within the sphere of the duties and beliefs it imposes upon him, nor even when he harbors no ambition other than to comprehend it sufficiently to render his obedience. Indeed, there exist in all religions dogmas that require explanation, principles whose consequences remain to be developed, laws that lack clear application, and wholly forgotten questions which assuredly touch upon the most vital interests of humanity. The endeavor to address all these necessities demands profound mental exertion. Consequently, the intellect is impelled to exercise its inherent faculties by the very desire to believe and to obey. Yet, this impulse does not yield uniform results universally, nor does it operate upon all intellects in an identical manner. Certain intellects concede no ground to individual independence. They propel the principle of authority to its ultimate conclusions and establish, alongside written revelation, wherein naught but dogmas, principles, and broad laws are found, an oral revelation, a tradition, or perhaps a permanent power infallible in its decrees. This constitutes a kind of living tradition that provides the explanations, forms, and minutiae of religious life, thereby forging and imposing unity, if not in faith, then at least in cult and symbolism. Such is the nature of the orthodox across all faiths. Conversely, other intellects place their trust in none but themselves, which is to say, in their own power of reasoning, to bridge these chasms and resolve the enigmas within the revealed word. Any authority aside from that of the sacred texts appears to them as a usurpation, or, should they defer to it at all, they do so only when it aligns with their personal sentiments. Gradually, however, their mental faculties, reflection, and judgment acquire firmness and maturation. Rather than merely exerting themselves upon religious dogmas, they transcend them. They seek in their own reason, in their own conscience, or in the conscience and reason of their fellow men. In short, within the works of human wisdom, those beliefs they were once compelled to accept as descending bodily from the heavens. Finally, there exists within this sphere a third class of thinkers, those who do not acknowledge tradition, or at least remain unsatisfied by tradition and authority, and who decidedly cannot or dare not employ reasoning. On the one hand, they are too elevated in their intellectual disposition to accept the revealed word in a natural and historical sense that aligns with the literal interpretation and the spirit of the masses. On the other hand, they cannot conceive that humanity might dispense entirely with revelation, or that truth might reach man through any avenue other than the efficacy of divine instruction. Consequently, they perceive naught but symbols and imagery in the majority of dogmas, precepts, and religious narratives. They search ceaselessly for a mysterious and profound significance that resonates with their own thoughts and sentiments, a meaning which, being preconceived, can neither be discovered within nor extrapolated from the sacred texts save through more or less arbitrary methods. It is primarily by this methodology and this inclination that the mystics are identified. I do not imply that mysticism has not occasionally manifested in a bolder guise. In an era when philosophical habits had already taken hold, mysticism discovers within this very consciousness the divine action, the immediate revelation it deems indispensable to humanity. It recognizes this revelation either within the emotions or within the intuitions of reason. Such is the manner, to cite but one example, in which mysticism was conceived during the 15th century by Gerson. Yet, when mystical ideas necessitate the reinforcement of external sanction, such support can manifest solely in the form of a symbolic interpretation of that which people designate as their holy scriptures. These three intellectual tendencies, these three modalities of comprehending revelation and perpetuating its work, are evident throughout the history of all religions that have taken root within the human soul. I shall cite only those religions that are most proximate to us and which, consequently, we may understand with greater certainty. Within the bosom of Christianity, the Roman Church epitomizes tradition and authority in their supreme degree of splendor. We observe reason applied to faith not solely within the majority of Protestant communions, among the proponents of so-called rational exegesis, but equally among the scholastic philosophers, who were the foremost to subject religious dogmas to the laws of the syllogism and who demonstrated the identical reverence for the words of Aristotle as they did for the words of the apostles. Who could fail to perceive symbolic mysticism with its arbitrary methodology and exaggerated spirituality, across all the Gnostic sects, in Origen, in Jacob Boehme, and in all who tread in their footsteps. However, no one advanced this system as far, nor formulated it as candidly and boldly, as Origen, whose name we shall encounter again within this volume. If we cast a glance upon the religion of Muhammad, and if, among the multitude of sects it engendered, we pause to examine those which display a resolute character, we are immediately struck by the identical spectacle. The Sunnis and the Shiites, whose schism arose from individual rivalries rather than from any pronounced divergence in doctrine, equally champion the cause of unity and orthodoxy. To achieve their objective, the former admit, alongside the Quran, a compilation of traditions known as the Sunnat, from which their name is derived. The latter, the Shiites, repudiate this tradition but supplant it with a living authority, a species of continuous revelation, inasmuch as one of the most quintessential tenets of their faith decrees that, following the Prophet, his apostle Ali and the imams of his lineage stand as the representatives of God on earth. Islamism likewise possessed its scholastic philosophers, known by the appellation of the Mutakallimin, and it produced a vast array of heresies that appear to have wedded the doctrine of Pelagius to the rationalistic method of modern Protestantism. This is the manner in which a celebrated Orientalist defined the latter. All sects of the Mutazilas concur generally in their denial of the existence of attributes within God, and they endeavor specifically to eschew anything that might compromise the dogma of divine unity. Furthermore, in order to uphold the justice of God and to preclude any imputation of injustice unto him, they grant humanity absolute liberty over its own actions, denying any divine interference therein. Finally, they are united in teaching that all knowledge requisite for salvation falls within the province of reason, and that it may be attained exclusively through the light of reason, both prior to and following revelation. The Karmates, whose genesis dates to the year 264 of the Hijra, embraced the system of allegorical interpretation alongside all the tenets that serve as the foundation for mysticism. If we are to credit the previously cited author, who merely translates the words of an Arabian historian, they titled their doctrine the science of the inner faculties, a system which consists in transmuting the precepts of Islamism into allegories and in substituting imaginative constructs for external observances, as well as in allegorizing verses of the Quran to yield strained and forced interpretations. There exists more than one point of resemblance between this doctrine and the one with which we presently aim to acquaint ourselves. Finally, we arrive at Judaism, from whose bosom, nourished by its spirit and its essence, sprang the two rival creeds already cited. We have intentionally reserved the final place for Judaism, as it leads us naturally into our primary subject. Alongside the Bible, Orthodox Jews recognize traditions that command from them the identical reverence accorded to the precepts of the Pentateuch. Initially transmitted orally and dispersed far and wide, subsequently compiled and redacted by Judah the Holy beneath the title of the Mishnah, and ultimately augmented and developed to a prodigious degree by the authors of the Talmud, these traditions now concede not the slightest domain to reason or liberty. Not only do they deny the existence of these two moral forces in principle, but they also strike them with paralysis by usurping their domain at every turn. They encompass all actions, ranging from the expression of exalted moral and religious sentiments to the basest functions of animal life. They have counted, regulated, and weighed all things in advance. It constitutes a quotidian and unceasing despotism, against which one is inevitably compelled to struggle through subterfuge, should he choose not to substitute a higher authority in its stead. The Quirites, who must not be confounded with the Sadducees, whose existence does not extend beyond the destruction of the Second Temple, are, in a sense, the Protestants of Judaism. They ostensibly reject tradition and claim to recognize nothing but the Bible, namely the Old Testament, for the interpretation of which human reason appears to them entirely sufficient. Yet others, without ceasing to be devout believers and fully acknowledging the principle of revelation. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.